impossible for us as a democracy and also undesirable to suppress worker wages and to keep household saving rates low. I mean, if you try doing that, you will have tremendous protest. So the government, recognizing this, has been trying to promote manufacturing, partly through the better logistics we talked about earlier, promised in the budget, but primarily through higher tariffs. That is, you increase the tariffs that you impose when products are imported. That gives domestic production protection by sort of making any imports more costly, and offering production subsidies for large manufacturers. So not only are you protected by higher tariffs, you also get government money if you produce domestically. So let's talk about cell phones. In 2017, tariffs on cell phones were raised to 20% from 10%. Many of you buy cell phones, and you are effectively buying a protected product, protected by 20% tariffs. What we've also seen since 2020 is production-linked subsidies of 6% of the invoice price on the cell phone is offered to manufacturers who expand production in India. So on the one hand, imports you have to pay a tariff on, which gives the domestic producer protection. On the other hand, the government also offers production subsidies to any cell phone produced in India. And the argument the government offers for this is that the electronics sector suffers the usual disadvantages in India because infrastructure is inadequate, the cost of finance is high, there isn't adequate power, it's not high quality, the Indian worker doesn't have design capabilities, and worker skills are inadequate. So all the usual problems they cite, and say, therefore, that puts our industry at about a 10% disadvantage. We're going to compensate for that through these production-linked subsidies and through tariff protection. And we're going to try and see whether, in fact, we get more production as a result. Now, the obvious question US students must ask is, who pays for this? And clearly, you're paying for it. Consumers in India would pay at least 20% more than the international market price for the cell phones. And also, essentially that protection is going to anybody who can produce in India at reasonable efficiency. But over and above that, they're getting production-linked subsidies. Now, I just did a comparison. The iPhone 13 Pro Max, this is an expensive phone, no doubt, but it's available for 90,366 rupees in Chicago today at the dollar-rupee exchange rate, inclusive of taxes. If you buy it in India, you will pay 129,000 rupees, 1,29,000 rupees, which is a markup of 43%. In other words, the iPhone that you're paying for is much more expensive than the iPhone that I pay for, and I'm reasonably sure that is true of other high-end models. Now, that probably extends lower down also. That tells me the domestic citizen is paying a lot for the privilege of having cell phones manufactured in India. Remember, your taxes are going to pay the 6% in production subsidy for every cell phone produced in India. Also remember that the value added to each cell phone, because so many of the parts are imported, the amount of value that is added by production in India is about only 20 to 25% of the total price of the cell phone. Put differently, we're getting the government to give 6% of the price in subsidies for production, which is about 20 to 25% of the value that is created, which means for every rupee of value that is created, the subsidy is about 30% of the value. That's an enormous subsidy. And of course, states add to this through power subsidies, land subsidies, capital expenditure subsidies. And so what we have is a lot of protection and a lot of subsidy to cell phone production in India. No wonder you see foreign manufacturers willing to flock in. Anybody would flock in if you gave them substantial subsidies. Now, maybe all this is worth it if we create a strong cell phone industry in India which matches world costs. The key then is whether the manufacturers become more efficient over time so we can remove the protection and the subsidies, or will they stay inefficient and lobby for continued subsidies? We tried this in the past, and we failed simply because the industrialists were never willing to let go. It was called the license permit Raj. Many of you were not born when it was in place, but it held back Indian manufacturing efficiency. It was the time when we produced the Ambassador car with no change for about 40 years. That's an example of the inefficiency that is created when we protect industry, but also subsidize them. Industry was never willing to forego protection, and the protection stayed in place with some people within industry making a lot of money with little progress. Already our firms are lobbying for PLI schemes to be extended to compensate for the pandemic period. And so the bottom line is, will they get more efficient? The jury is still out, but our past history suggests they will not. Furthermore, once you start putting tariffs on inputs, it becomes a tax on exports, and we are continuously putting more and more tariffs on inputs. Think of, for example, of our steel. We have put tariffs on steel so that our steel producers have protection. They're making a fair amount of profits, but in their profits, what happens is our car production becomes uncompetitive because our cars use steel as inputs. Then our car industry demands protection, and so protection tends to increase without necessarily making any of the participants more efficient. And of course, which industries get production-linked subsidies is totally non-transparent and completely discretionary. Every budget, the government decides which new industry will get subsidies, and it's not clear there's a process by which we decide. The problem is that eventually it may well be that taxpayer money goes to subsidize our biggest and well-connected firms, the Ambanis, the Adanis, the Tatas, rather than the sectors where India may have natural advantage. So why do I worry? I mean, this is something which dominates government thinking, and really to do better over time, we have to fix all the deficiencies the government itself recognizes. But in the meantime, we are locked into subsidizing our biggest firms while ignoring other pressing needs. We're talking about now subsidizing chip manufacturing to the extent of $10 billion. That's $10 billion that's not available to schooling, that's not available to our poor kids. If we could reallocate that $10 billion instead into maybe 200 first-class universities or 2,000 or maybe more high-quality high schools, we would not get chip manufacturing, but we would get chip design. And much of the value in the world is now in those high-skill services, such as chip design, rather than in manufacturing. So even the spending priorities need to be rethought. The last point before I move on to what the alternative is really, if even we are successful in this manufacturing-led growth, what we are seeing across the industrial world is more and more sort of protection being imposed there, simply because they found their manufacturing demolished by China. Now they're getting more protectionist, and the war, for example, in Ukraine gives them more incentive to become protectionist. Words like friendshoring, words like reshoring are emerging. They want to bring back industry into their countries. They're reluctant to accept another China storming its way to their domestic markets and decimating the small town manufacturers that still survive. So, you may ask, what's the alternative? And in the next few minutes, let me try and build the alternative and say why this is more attuned to what India's democracy sort of is capable of. There is an alternative path, and it builds on the old vision of increasing openness and liberalization, but also investment in our human capital, investment in your minds. It draws on your creativity, but also it draws on our liberal democracy. It caters to demand in the much larger global market, thus allowing us to get rich fast by producing for others. But instead of focusing on exporting goods, that is things, We should emphasize the export of services and ideas, where we already have a strong presence and some advantages relative to our competitors like China and Vietnam. Now, this is not either or. We can do both. But when it comes to spending priorities, such as should we spend on production-linked subsidies to our biggest industries, or on making sure that kids go back to school, I would say the latter has more weight. I am certainly not calling for packaging manufacturing, as sometimes people seem to suggest. We should continue to build out infrastructure. We should continue to encourage our manufacturers to seek out new global markets, not through protective tariffs and subsidies, but by fixing our deficiencies. Only then will they become globally competitive. And so by all means fix infrastructure, by all means improve the quality of our workers, and that means investing in humans, in human beings. But, and make the business environment easier for people to start businesses. So many of you can actually go out and create your own jobs. But we have limited resources. Let us not spend it on subsidies, and let us not get overly protective. Competition is what is going to be important to getting our manufacturing. I think the environment is favorable for service exports, even though it's getting more unfavorable for manufacturing exports. The pandemic has made it easy to provide high value-added services at a distance. Many of you have relatives who've worked through the pandemic at home, doing their jobs at a distance. And in industrial countries, 45% of jobs can be done from home. 30% in some sort of hybrid mode where you go into office maybe once a week, once in 2 weeks. 15% entirely at home. Think of IT, think of programming, think of payroll, think of HR. All those jobs can be done at home. And many of your relatives have done work entirely from home through the pandemic. So if you can service clients in Mumbai from Hyderabad as a consultant, or from Bangalore, why can't you service clients in Chicago from Hyderabad and Mumbai? In other words, why can't you export services? Just as we exported IT services. The market for services like consulting, legal, financial, advisory, education, telemedicine, these are all ripe for globalization. And services that are delivered online, unlike physical goods, do not cross a physical border where they can be stopped. There are other ways that you can erect impediments, but it's not so much that they're physical and can be stopped. Moreover, the United States and Europe are some of the largest producers of services and largest exporters. They themselves will be hurt if protectionism in services increases, and they have an incentive to agree to facilitate it. But India has another advantage. It's liberal democracy. A key element in providing these services is shared values and trust, especially around the data that are harvested. This automatically puts a number of authoritarian countries like China and Russia at a disadvantage. Think about it. No customer really cares where they're buying a vacuum cleaner, so long as it works well. So I don't care if it's from China, Russia, wherever, it should work well. But if I'm asked to share my medical records or my financial data, or if I'm a firm or employing consultants, my firm's intimate strategies, I care very much who I'm sharing it with. Will the provider protect my data? Will the provider's government snoop or use the data to blackmail me, especially when I'm doing it cross-border? Not only do I worry about it, but my government worries about it. It helps if the provider comes from a transparent and tolerant democracy that is driven by rule of law. Now, we have an advantage here. We have a democracy. Let's not erode it, let's build on it, let's strengthen it, because that will give us an advantage in providing services around the world. Similarly, Indians are known for services the world over. Everyone has a good Indian doctor or a doctor of Indian origin. Many CEOs are now of Indian origin, and many have had good consultants of Indian origin. The Indian diaspora has done India proud. So we already have a brand image. And the image of our software engineers working out of India has added to it. So we can build on that. People understand we can provide high quality services. And if our democratic credentials are strengthened rather than weakened, we have an advantage over other emerging countries. Final reason for why we should focus on services rather than emphasize manufacturing. Again, I'm not saying let's get rid of manufacturing, but let manufacturing go at its own pace rather than overly being encouraged by subsidies and tariffs. A final reason for why services is the world is going green. It simply is impossible for the world to consume at the pace at which it was consuming in the past, and for developing countries to consume at that rate. Increasingly more of the consumption basket will consist of services, even for moderate income countries. Think about what you spend on, and think about what your parents spent on when they were students. I would argue much more of your spending goes on things like a cell phone and your cell phone payment plan, rather than on things that they used to spend on. So if we are thinking decades ahead, would it not make more sense to lay more of our eggs in the service basket? Now this raises two immediate questions. Will there be enough jobs through services, and what do we need to do differently? So start first with, will there be enough jobs? Now people say, look, only manufacturing can create jobs. But look, I'm not saying let's abandon manufacturing. I'm talking about new thrust areas. So manufacturing will continue. We will have successes in leather. We will have successes in electronics and so on. But again, construction, which is a service, will be a big source of growth. We will have more flats constructed, more highways constructed, etc. Those jobs will continue to grow. But we will have new thrust areas. Consider education, which many of you obviously are familiar with. In many high-skilled services, only the lack of a recognized degree and trust stops our people from serving the world. So some of your friends go abroad for an MBA, master's, PhD, and immediately get a job there. It's harder for you to do that because it's harder for degrees in India to get recognized. Can we bridge that gap by creating quality higher education in India from places like your university, but others, and therefore provide more of a degree to many of our youth, which allow them to become internationally mobile in terms of the services they provide. But also in doing so, can we create a service for the youth of the world? Why can't our high quality universities attract students from our neighbors, from Africa, from the Middle East, from Southeast Asia? We used to do a reasonable amount. Can't we do much more by creating high quality universities? And then the people who come here from abroad and go back will be our ambassadors, just like our diaspora is, and allow us to build networks around them. We can also, even today, deliver education into people's homes around the world. Baiju is an example, much advertised, but there are many others. EdTech can create many jobs for software-assisted tutors, for the programmers, etc. And every good skilled job creates 4 or 5 more jobs for the less skilled. In every school, university, or EdTech platform, you're also not just creating jobs for teachers and tutors and programmers, but also jobs for clerical staff, coaches, cooks, cleaners, ground staff, security guards. Our ambition should be to make everyone capable of getting the good jobs. But in the meantime, there will be a transition in which these other jobs will rely, in a sense, on the incomes of the good jobs. And so there will be many more jobs. This is just the possibilities in education. There are possibilities in medicine, fintech, consultancy, legal services, and of course in travel and tourism, which tend to be very employment intensive. The point I'm trying to make is we have an advantage in services. We can be the first developing country that transitions directly to services without going fully through manufacturing. Now there's already some evidence of what Danny Roderick from Harvard calls premature deindustrialization. But rather than being a problem, that may actually be an evidence of our movement in a direction which is more suitable for our capabilities. Now, let me end by just saying, look, we have deficiencies. Let's be clear about them. A service-led path will require us to have many more people with high-quality capabilities. So we absolutely must put people first, something our democracy hasn't done enough of in the past. Second, we require a government that is more pragmatic, transparent, decentralized, dynamic, open to talent. Either our state governments or our national governments today, but they can adapt. We do need a learning government because the path, if we go down this, is a new path, not something for which there's a playbook that is available. And third, we have to change the world. The world order has to be made much more hospitable to trade and services. Services have been historically protected in developed countries, for example, by licensing requirements. If you're a doctor in India, you've got to jump through many hoops to get a license to practice in the UK or in the US. If you're doing telemedicine, you still have to jump through those hoops. Can we make those hoops easier to jump? And India certainly has to participate in leading global change here because the industrial countries will not do it for us. Let me just quickly walk through these three in the next few minutes. First, putting people first. In order to draw our best talent, we have to give everyone a fair chance, starting from our biggest minority, women, but including our biggest religious minorities and our disadvantaged. In this state, a discriminatory society doesn't just waste talent, it's also immoral. It's also weak because it's internally divided and it has few friends in the community of nations. If other democracies are our target markets, and they will be a big target market, we certainly cannot be seen as creating second-class citizens of our people, of our minorities. For instance, nothing has upset the Western society more about China prompting sanctions and boycotts than its treatment of Uyghurs. So we absolutely must be non-discriminatory. Second, people, even the very poor, know what is best for them. We must empower them to seek out better futures for their children by putting cash in their hands via direct cash. Tamil Nadu, for example, today has moved from funding marriage ornaments for girls in an attempt to ease their way into marriage, but changed the allocation of those funds to supporting university education for girls. Thereby, I think, moving in the right direction, given this larger agenda. Now, of course, even if the government moves into this agenda, it can be unresponsive to local or individual needs. One remedy is to decentralize government, devolving funds, functions, and functionaries, not just from the center to states, but also importantly from states to municipalities and panchayats. Your panchayat should be able to make a lot of decisions because it knows what is going on and it can adopt policies more suitable to the locality than the centrally set policies. Moreover, municipalities and panchayats can learn from each other's successes. Decentralization gives people a greater sense of control over their destiny. For example, today, the teacher who comes to the village to teach in the government school responds to the state government, not to the local panchayat. But isn't the local panchayat and the local people much better able to see whether the teacher actually shows up, whether the teacher actually teaches, and able to both reward and punish the teacher based on performance? So what if that power to reward and punish moved down to the panchayat, did stay at the state level? That's the kind of decentralization we need in order to improve the functioning of government. A second important aspect is to put greater weight on individual rights and freedoms and push courts to enforce them. Today, central and state authorities routinely suppress critics and prevent change by using draconian acts like the UAPA and the Sedition Act. Far from protecting the public from criminals and terrorists, the act is often mismerging from the broader public, but criticism is a good thing because it allows the government to learn. So, because the service-led growth path into middle-income status is something we haven't tried before, we need a learning government. A learning government is one that experiments widely, first at a small scale, then rolls it out widely, and it shares data both on its successes and failures, listens to critics. This is what allows for good government, because you have to understand when you're going wrong and you have to take remedial action. So in this kind of government, important decisions are not taken by a small coterie at the center, but arrived at through debate in cabinet, in parliament, and various fora. So we avoid the kind of imposition of laws that are essentially created in closed rooms without widespread debate. We also need data to be widely available and not suppressed. Data, for example, on deaths from COVID, from the level of unemployment, because that tells us where we're going wrong, allows us to remedy. And of course, I already talked about protecting free speech and criticism so that the powerful can learn when they're going wrong and correct decisions. Finally, we need to lead global change. Service-led exports requires change elsewhere. For instance, telemedicine requires our medical degrees to be recognized elsewhere. We've already talked about that. But it would be great if Medicare, Medicaid, and the National Health Service paid for treatment provided from India. Now, that can be negotiated. We can say we will lower our tariffs for manufacturing goods if you accept our service providers providing Medicare, providing for your Medicare patients, Medicaid patients, the National Health Service in the UK patients. If they pay for it, our doctors will have greater incomes. We can create more, institutes teaching doctors. We can move more people out of low income into higher income. These changes need to be part of our negotiating stance on international agreements, which today is much more focused on protecting our agricultural products and creating space for our services. And of course, India is going to be the G20 president next year. Why not use the forum to shift the world to debating these issues? And finally, as we're moving towards global change, we also need to reform our laws and frameworks in a number of areas. For instance, if the world worries about data protection and privacy and fears hostile foreign governments accessing their citizens' data, this is something that is in our interest also. Can we enact data privacy laws protecting our individuals, but also allowing our firms to assure foreign customers as well as domestic users that their data will be safe and will be protected even from our own government? So, bottom line, and this is where I'll end, I'm calling for an Indian growth path that draws on the capabilities of all Indians and builds on India's strength of tolerance and respect for all, which makes the idea of India so loved the world over. I'm calling for a path that builds on India's unique democracy. Not just the fact that we have regular elections, but that the argumentative Indian can debate and criticize, that we can have ideas that are diametrically opposite to the government's. It is our democratic nature that will improve the quality of our own government, and it will also make us trusted by citizens elsewhere in the world. And part of that is treating all our citizens equally and with tolerance and respect for their differences. I'm calling for India to become ambitious, not just on the basis of ideas of the past, but because we have a new vision of green, inclusive, local-led growth and development. And we persuade the world of it by showing it that this form of growth actually works. Let me stop there.